My name is Jay Burcham. I'm the president of Provenio Group, and we do these webinars to help folks during specific times of the year with some of the issues you might be dealing with. Right now we're heading into testing time, so it's a great time to step back and look at what is test anxiety, what is stress, how can we utilize the resources we have and actually deal with that, and then how can we help our kids test better. So let's jump in and get started. The first thing you look at is what is stress. And the reason you look at stress as an impetus event is because stress in its very nature is meant to keep you from thinking as clearly as possible and instead to prepare your body for physical action. And so what you look at is what is the body's response to stress. Well, stress is the fight or flight response. It involves a cascade of changes that prepares you for emergency action, and what happens is the hypothalamus sets off this alarm, and from this alarm you have into your sympathetic nervous system a stream of hormones of adrenaline, of norepinephrine, most importantly of cortisol, and that gets your major muscle groups ready to run. It gets you begin sweating so that your body can cool down quickly. You have this very physical guttural reaction to a physical or emotional stimuli. And when you start looking at that, what you see is that the parasympathetic nervous system is where you have the relaxation response, but the sympathetic nervous system is where you have that fight or flight response. One of the real interesting things oftentimes you hear is that your heart or is it your head, and what you'll see is that sympathetic nervous system versus parasympathetic, most of the parasympathetic, or the ability to calm down, is cerebral, whereas most of the ability to enter into the fight or flight response is actually predicated upon more at the physical. So think about it in those terms. You're having a physical guttural reaction to a stimuli. And when you begin to look at that, what that means is that our bodies are incredibly intricate. Let me give you an example, just real quickly. This is a dendron. Well, dendron is the Greek word for tree. And think about that sympathetic nervous system. All of a sudden, it's entering into the fight or flight response. That means that an electrical impulse is generated here within the cell body. And this dendron begins sending that electrical impulse down the trunk of the tree. Dendron's the Greek word for tree. And so it moves down this axon or trunk. It's conducted across a substance called the myelin sheath. It gets to these little ball points called the nodes of Ranvier, and this is where something called the action potential begins. The action potential is the secretion of neurotransmitters or hormones into these synaptic clefts, and that's where you start to see epinephrine and norepinephrine or cortisol. And what that does is it causes a real stimulated electrical impulse to be generated across the synaptic cleft, and this one single electrical impulse is shot out, tens of times to hundreds of times, where it's picked up by several different dendrons, and all of a sudden one electrical impulse becomes 100, becomes 1,000, literally becoming millions of electrical impulses just to prepare your body for the fight or flight response, just to create breathing or blinking or sweating. That's how intricate our body is. And because of that intricacy, and because our bodies are preparing for fight or flight, you start looking at physical stimuli, also emotional stimuli. What causes stressful events? A kid seeing a bully on the playground, whether the bully's coming to him or not, can trigger a stress-induced situation. Well, a lot of our kids have the same problem with testing. And test anxiety is a very real thing. So let's parse kids into two groups. We have the kids who have test anxiety because they flat out don't prepare for testing. That's a very different group than kids that actually suffer from test stress. And so kids who have test anxiety centered around the inability or lack of study, like I said, that's a different group, but it's still a group that needs to be addressed. Here's the reason why. If you have kids, especially younger kids, and they begin to test, and they test poorly because they're ill prepared, they're developing habits. And habits tend to create self-fulfilling prophecies. Those self-fulfilling prophecies, when you fail and you tend to fail more, you begin to develop defense mechanisms around not caring so much that you fail or else becoming stressed by it. And the thing is, teachers can no longer take for granted that kids actually understand how to study. And so what you talk about, there are reasons why you have test anxiety if you're poorly prepared. For example, lack of preparation, cramming the night before, poor time management, all of those things. But there's a different group, the kids that not just because of preparation are struggling, but the ones who actually have a physical reaction to a testing event. That is, their body actually enters into that fight or flight mode. They begin testing, and all of a sudden you see kids that are damping their hands on their pants because their palms are sweaty, rubbing their foreheads because they may have a headache. Kids that develop upset stomach as testing time nears or become tense. Those are kids who are actually having a physical reaction to an emotional stimuli, which is the testing event. And the thing is, there's a very real impact when your body enters into that fight or flight mode. Remember the bifurcation or the split between the mind or the brain and the physical, the body, the sympathetic versus parasympathetic. Well, what happens is when you begin to experience the effects of test anxiety, you enter into a nervous stage. By your body's definition, when you're nervous, you don't think as clearly. That's why you see people who are nervous that tend to drop things or fumble or will stumble. The reason why is the mind is not worried so much about the intricacy of detail as it is preparing itself for a fight or a flight. And therefore you'd have an inability or a lack of ability to organize your thoughts as well as you normally would, to be able to retrieve key words or key concepts, and generally doing poor on examinations because that's not what your mind is prepared for at the moment. You can go a step further into that group of kids that has the physical reaction to test stress. They can go into full-on mental blocking. That's where they go completely blank on answers. And in fact, as soon as you take the test up, you can ask them a similar question, and they know the answer. And you knew that they knew the material before you got started, but they can't recall it during that testing event. That's test stress. And when mental blocking occurs, it's not a lack of preparation. It's not a lack of effort. It's literally a physical reaction to the stimuli or testing event that's causing them to have poor testing capacity. And so you begin looking at, how do I reduce test anxiety? Once again, let's talk about the different groups of kids. The kids who are not studying, not preparing, you can't take for granted that they actually understand what it means to study. A lot of kids think that just reading the material will prepare them for it, but that doesn't begin the critical thinking process, the process of actually synthesizing information and preparing yourself for recall. So go through with them what it means to study. Go through good time management, to avoid cramming and all that, but also talk about the process of actually taking notes from a lecture. In fact, give a test lecture, have them take notes off of it, and then check their notes to see if they're picking up on key phrases, key words, key points. In other words, are they understanding the concept of what you're lecturing? Have them make a chart or an outline of what they've just heard. See if they can take the information that's been given to them, synthesize it, conceptualize it, and then give it back to you in a note form. That lets you know that they understand how to study. If they can't do those things, then what they're doing is rote memorization, which is the poorest form of learning because you erase it as soon as you take it. So help them understand how to study. But for the kids who are struggling from a real physical reaction, you've got to go a step beyond. Oftentimes kids who test poorly due to actual test stress, it's not the lack of planning, it's not the lack of preparation. In fact, these kids tend to study more than the others because they do so poorly and they become frustrated by it and they want to overcome it. These kids, you actually have to teach the deployment of relaxation techniques. Now then, remember, this is a sympathetic nervous system response to a stimulating or what's seen as a stressing event. That means you actually have to employ the parasympathetic nervous system and stop this process of stress, stop this prolonged exposure of cortisol that keeps you in a heightened physical state. The incredible thing about our body is that when we enter into the fight or flight response, we have these short bursts of energy. This short burst of our major muscle masses receiving the majority of the blood flow. And that may sound overly dramatic for a testing situation, but it occurs. And the kids have an inability to think as clearly as possible when they're in that situation. And in fact, when you have a prolonged exposure to a stressing event, you move from a heightened sense of alertness to actually a dulled sense of alertness. And so you have to be able to trigger what's called the relaxation response. That's when the parasympathetic nervous system actually begins secreting serotonin that causes a reuptake, or what's called acetylcholinesterase, or reuptake of the cortisol back into those synaptic clefts, which allows for a calming effect and therefore the ability to retrieve information. There's some real quick cues that kids who are entering into a test stress situation or a test stress feeling can do to cut that off and actually be able to recognize cognizant capacity to recall information. Some of them are simple things like taking long, deep breaths. A kid who is beginning to lose track of their ability to recall information, if they will take 3 to 4 very deep breaths, it does a couple of things. One, it oversaturates the lung tissue with oxygen, which forces it into the bloodstream. That forcing of oxygen into the bloodstream and the major muscle tissues will actually cause the muscles to reuptake that cortisol and move it out of the system, triggering a relaxation response. When you close your eyes or you look up and count to 10, the looking up process is actually removing yourself physically from the stressing event, which is the test in front of you. Counting to 10 is a prolonged disengagement from that process, which allows you to relax a little and start over. Closing your eyes, counting to 5, similar thing. Clenching your fist. Think about that. If you clench your fist real hard and let go, you feel a rush. What happens when you're clenching your fist? That's when you have that epinephrine and cortisol actually going into that muscle group. When you relax or let go, it's the reuptake of it and the push of blood into the extremities away from the major muscle masses, and that triggers a relaxation response within a muscle group. And what you're trying to do is basically trick your mind into relaxing by relaxing parts of your body. If it doesn't work with your fist, tightening up your muscles, especially the quadriceps in your legs, pushing blood into that, tightening them up, holding it for a count, and then letting go. Once again, that causes the reoxygenation of those muscle masses, which causes a re-trigger of the relaxation response to a muscle mass, which can trick the brain into actually entering into the relaxation response. The final one, for example, writing your name 3 times. When you have a kid that actually goes into mental blocking, it can become self-fulfilling. They've done poorly, they continue to do poorly, they're struggling, they can't collect the answers, and they begin putting up walls to information. Having them turn away and write their name 3 times is a physical activity, writing their name. And it's doing something they can easily recognize, their name itself, and that oftentimes will allow them to tear down that information barrier that allows them to begin pulling and synthesizing information again. These are all real simple ways of getting someone who is in the midst of a heightened sense of stress due to an acuity-based situation or testing, and therefore they have a diminished cognizant capacity because of it, triggering a physical response that begins the relaxation response within the sympathetic nervous system. Simple ways of getting the body to trick itself into restarting. There are other things you can do from an environmental standpoint. For example, when kids are testing and they're easily put into a stress-induced situation because of testing, you really have to minimize the external stimuli with these kids. You have to help them understand that distractions are a point of life, but you want to minimize distractions. Close your door. Kids who have a hard time concentrating and a hard time retrieving information and are easily distracted can enter into that stress situation much easier when they have external stimuli. Close your door. Close the blinds if you need to. And by doing that, realize you need a certain level of lighting. Use at least 75-watt bulbs in the classroom to keep it light. It's better to be cool than warm. Once again, the main reason why you want blood flow to the extremities. That's the way that the body actually cools itself, calms itself, warms itself by keeping the extremities normalized. Neatness. If your room is cluttered and messy, kids who tend to have cluttered thought patterns and are easily stress-induced can actually enter into that stage by looking at the clutter around them. Comfort. You don't want your kids so comfortable that they don't pay attention, but at the same time, you don't want them in tight little tables. Instead, a good desk, just sitting in comfort, being able to recognize and recall information. So there are physical things you can do with the environment to assist kids in having the best ability possible to retrieve information. There are also things you can do within your LEAPS lessons. There are some very specific examples. So, for example, under stress and anxiety, understanding stress, dealing with sudden stress, the stress of a classroom, and then the obvious calming down when taking a test. Those lessons are there for you, but there are some other ones. For example, under friends, there's a lesson, friends in the classroom. Outside of friends, you can move on to anger and emotional management, and there you're going to have lessons such as overcoming classroom fears. Outside of anger and emotional management, you also have managing time and attention, which has some very important lessons. For example, the need for attention, focusing on the task at hand, also dealing with distraction type lessons. And then there's a really big one that a lot of people don't stop and think about, and it's found under communication and presentation. And it's the lesson receiving instructions. Oftentimes, kids who find themselves in a stress-induced situation, testing event, they can't recognize or recall information, will oftentimes make very simple mistakes because they flat out didn't follow the instructions. Whereas if they would have followed the instructions, they wouldn't have had that trigger event that stressed them. So helping kids understand how to receive and follow instructions. These are real simple ways of looking at some of the basic tenets of emotional development and how you qualify those into the classroom. Now, a lot of folks that come on late, don't worry about trying to remember what all those lessons are. We'll actually send you the list of lessons at the end of the webinar. You can also go into classroom challenges and use things such as self-control to figure out what do you need to teach to your class, what's going on in your class that helps them calm down from a holistic standpoint. So what can you do? The first thing is recognize that stress and test stress is very real. Stress is a physical response to physical or emotional stimuli. A test is an actual stimulus event that can trigger a stressful reaction. Look for the physical signs. Look for the kids that have an overt reaction to a testing situation. And the way you do this is you actually prepare kids for testing by practicing the test. Practice quizzes, pop quizzes, and do the pop quiz not just to gather information, but to see who amongst your kids is struggling with the process of testing, who gets overly anxious, who gets an upset stomach, who gets sweaty palms, who are the kids that are struggling with it, and then begin to explain the cause and effect to your students. Help them understand that test stress can be a real thing, that you can become stressed by a testing situation, and at the same time, you can de-stress yourself by entering in those relaxation techniques and getting your body to relax. That means you're going to have to explain those relaxation techniques to the kids, but don't just explain it. Show them how to do it. Because oftentimes you tell a kid, look, take deep breaths. They're going to laugh that off and think that sounds silly. Model it for them, get them to do it, and let them understand the actual implications of going through these relaxation techniques to trigger the relaxation response from the sympathetic nervous system. And finally, and this is a real big one, the teaching to the test has become part of our nomenclature. It is pop cultural almost. We talk about the test in big letters. This time of the year, it's in the news, it's in the newspapers, and oftentimes it's all-consuming in certain situations in schools. That puts the testing situation up on a pedestal and makes it even more stressful for kids who actually have test stress issues. Demystify the test. Explain what it is. Yes, it's important. Yes, you should get your sleep the night before. Yes, you should prepare. At the same time, it's information you know or you don't know. When you know it, you mark it, you move on. When you don't know it, you take your, whatever your situation is, you take your best bet guess or you move on. Whatever your instructions are, demystify the test for the kids. Help them understand that it's part of the process, but it's not the entire process. Help them understand that they can take the time, seconds within that test, to relax if they need to. Debunk, demystify, and bring that test down off a pedestal, because the higher it's up there on the pedestal, the more jacked up the kids are for it. That may be fine for some kids, but it's damaging for others. Help them relax by putting it into perspective. So that's something to stop and think about. as you begin looking at test stress and anxiety, help your kids understand that's part of life. And part of growing and maturing is dealing with stressful events, being able to calm yourself down from those stressful events, actually controlling your physical reactions through mental and emotional processes, and then help them understand that through the real life and real world examples. So that's our 20 minutes. I want to thank you for participating. Those that came on late, we'll actually send you a copy of the presentation. And also we'll have a link set up on the dashboard beginning tomorrow that has recorded versions of the test stress webinar. If there's anything we can do for any of you, please don't hesitate to call or come by and visit us at goleaps.com. Online training is available. We have a lot of new functions for LEAPS that I think you'd find real interesting. For example, automated progress reports are now available in LEAPS. The ability to assess an entire class at once in a computer lab is now available in LEAPS. The ability to automate progress reports for a group is now in LEAPS. So if you haven't seen those, go look at them. And if you want some training on it, go to goleaps.com/online training. Sign up for free training. We'll get you trained and up and going on your progress reporting, your fidelity reporting. And as you enter into testing time, good luck to your students, and I hope you have a great day.